Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the discography of the legendary English rock band Radiohead. I've been doing these tier list videos for a while now. This is my 56th one, and I've purposely avoided doing Radiohead up to this point because I know it can come off as sort of cliche, and it's a band and a discography that has already been covered and discussed by so many different people over the years. But after a while, I figured I might as well throw together a tier list for any regular viewers of the channel who might be interested in my Radiohead takes, and for any new viewers who are interested in hearing yet another person rank Radiohead studio albums. So what I'm going to do today is go through their 9 studio albums, starting with Pablo Honey and going up to A Moon-Shaped Pool, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 9 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1993 titled Pablo Honey. And I'm going to give this one a C. Not a great first album, in my opinion, and most Radiohead fans do share that same sentiment. At this early point in their discography, they hadn't fully fleshed out their sound and style, so there is a good chunk of this album that does sound very different from the future Radiohead records that would follow it. The majority of this album falls under what I would say is like a pretty standard alt-rock sort of vibe, and although a lot of this record doesn't contain a lot of those groundbreaking experimental elements of the Radiohead sound that we would hear on future releases, it still does have a handful of songs that I think are good. It's 12 tracks long, and I would say about half of the album is pretty decent. I think the opening track, You, is absolutely amazing. In my opinion, one of the more interesting tracks on the album, with some progressive elements in the groove, with the time signature alternating between 3 bars of 6/8 and 1 bar of 5/8. Very strong opener, in my opinion. And obviously, this record spawned their classic hit Creep, which is the follow-up track. And although this song is very overplayed and has become somewhat of a meme at this point, I still think it is a perfectly solid rock song. I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite Radiohead songs, but I think it's still a very fine track regardless. After the opening 2 songs, the album does start to lose me on certain tracks, and for me the remainder of this record basically consists of a couple of songs that I like, sandwiched in between a good chunk of songs that I find pretty underwhelming. As far as other songs that I like on here, I think Stop Whispering is a great song, Vegetable is awesome, and the closing track Blowout is my favorite track on here by far. And to me, this is the song that comes the closest to sounding like late 90s Radiohead, just a very dreamy and vibey song that concludes the album so nicely. So I think this record starts and ends with 2 very solid tracks and has a couple of songs in between that are very nice, but largely I do find the majority of this album to be underwhelming, and it doesn't contain a lot of those core elements that I love about the Radiohead sound. So I would say it's not a great debut album, but it still has a couple of great songs in the midst of that, so I will give this a C. Alright, moving on, we have their second studio album from 1995 titled The Bends, and I will give this an A. I really enjoy this album. I think it was a significant improvement from Pablo Honey. Musically, I think everything got much more interesting on here, still using those alt-rock elements from the previous record, but also veering off into some more artsy directions with this great mixture of harder electric guitar-centered songs, as well as acoustic tracks and a few ballads. The album is 12 tracks long, and it kicks things off beautifully with Planet Telex, a personal favorite of mine from this record, and a song that clearly illustrates that the band is evolving and going into new unexplored territories on this record. And from that point on, we get a very consistent batch of tracks with beautiful ballads like High and Dry, Fake Plastic Trees, and Bulletproof I Wish I Was, as well as some great acoustic-centered tracks like Nice Dream and Just, and those are balanced out very nicely with some harder alt-rock and art rock tracks like The Bends, My Iron Lung, and the closing track, Street Spirit Fade Out, which is another amazing closing track and another high point of this record for me. The only 2 tracks on here that I've never been crazy about are Black Star and Sulk, which both happen back-to-back before the final track of the album, and that would be the only moment where this record loses any sort of momentum for me. And obviously that is a huge improvement from Pablo Honey, which was filled with a lot of skip-over tracks for me personally. But my favorite songs songs on here would be High and Dry, Planet Telex, Fake Plastic Trees, and the closer, Street Spirit Fade Out. So I think this is an amazing album, a significant improvement from Pablo Honey, but at the same time, I think they still have even stronger records that would follow it. So not going to be an S tier, but still very close regardless. I will give this one an A. Alright, next we have their third studio album from 1997 titled OK Computer. And obviously this one gets an S. This is a masterpiece of an album that many people regard as Radiohead's best record. For me personally, it goes down as my second favorite album of theirs. The songwriting on this one feels so polished, and the entire album connects together in a very cohesive and deliberate manner. And the production from Nigel Godrich is top-notch and is definitely a contributing factor in this album sounding as polished as it does. It's 12 tracks long, and I think songwriting-wise, it was a creative explosion on their part, and it spawned numerous tracks that are now regarded as some of Radiohead's most classic songs, with tracks like No Surprises, Karma Police, Paranoid Android, Exit Music for a Film, and Let Down, amongst others. And most of the album almost plays through like a greatest hits record because there is just one classic Radiohead song after the next. In addition to the hits, there are also some seriously amazing B-sides with tracks like Climbing Up the Walls and The Tourist. If I had to pick a couple of favorites on here, I would go with Karma Police, No Surprises, Airbag, and Paranoid Android. The only song on here that I've never been able to get into is Electioneering. I've tried, and that's just the one song that doesn't do anything for me when I listen to this record. Not sure why that is, but if it wasn't for that one track, I would say that this is pretty much a perfect album from front to back. But regardless of that, it was still a big improvement from the previous album. And at this point in their discography, on their third record, I would say that they have reached their full potential as a group and delivered one of the best records of their discography and easily one of the best rock records to come out of the 90s. So an incredible album, my second favorite Radiohead record. This one gets an easy S. Alright, next we have their fourth studio album from 2000 titled Kid A, and this one will also get an S. This is an amazing album that takes a pretty significant departure from OK Computer and delivers us an amazing batch of 10 tracks that are more centered in this electronic, experimental, ambient, and art rock sort of realm. And I think they did an amazing job of following up the success of OK Computer by giving the listener something that is a total curveball stylistically, but I think is almost equally as high in quality. I would say I like OK Computer slightly more, but I definitely think this album can give it a run for its money. It opens up with Everything in Its Right Place, which I think is the best opening track of any Radiohead album. I remember years and years ago when I first put on this record and I heard that dark opening synth line, I was just completely intrigued, and they had me from that point on. This album got my complete, full, and undivided attention, and it's definitely a song that would make my top 10 Radiohead track list. I think it's just an absolutely incredible and very moody track that kickstarts this album beautifully. And from that point on, the album takes you through this wild and ambient journey that gives you the full range of emotions from dreamy and euphoric to dark and mysterious. And this album has some of the most unique and beautiful synth sounds of any 2000s album, in my opinion. We get the full scope of the electronic soundscapes that they are capable of creating on songs like Kid A, Tree Fingers, Idiotech, Morning Bell, and Motion Picture Soundtrack. We get a couple of more rock tracks like the National Anthem and Optimistic, which balance things out very nicely. And we get the very beautiful and dark acoustic ballad How to Disappear Completely, which I think is placed in the perfect spot as the fourth track of the album and does a great job of contrasting the opening three songs. If I had to pick a couple of favorites on here, I would go with Everything in Its Right Place, Idiotech, and Kid A, all of which would make my top 10 favorite Radiohead song list, but I do not think there is a bad song throughout this record, and if I'm ever in the mood to just completely zone out to an album, this would definitely be my number one choice from the Radiohead discography. And it's a perfect record to show the further evolution that would take place in their sound after the amazing success of OK Computer. And with OK Computer being an almost impossible album to follow, I don't think they could have done a better job with this record. So another amazing release. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have their fifth studio album from 2001 titled Amnesiac, and I will give this a B. This is a record that I've always had a lot of conflicting thoughts about. There are certain things that I absolutely love about it, but there's also parts that I do find a bit challenging. The tracks on here were recorded during the same sessions as Kid A, and rather than releasing Kid A as a double album, they decided to split them into two different records, which resulted in Amnesiac. Similar to Kid A, this album takes on more experimental and electronic flavors, but I do think musically, Kid A is much more consistent from front to back. It's 11 tracks long, and one of my reasons for being so conflicted about this album is that it features a couple of tracks that I would regard as some of my favorite Radiohead songs, with tracks like Pyramid Song, which is easily in my top 5 Radiohead song list, one of the coolest songs they've ever written, in my opinion. And then another one that would also go down as a favorite of mine is Knives Out, such a beautiful guitar part with some really colorful chord movements and an equally beautiful and haunting melody from Tom York. Some other standout tracks for me would be I Might Be Wrong and the different version of Morning Bell, which in my opinion takes on a much more eerie tone in comparison to the version on Kid A. And although this album has a decent chunk of songs that I think are great, it does have a few tracks that in my opinion do hurt the momentum of the album quite a bit, with tracks like Polk, Pull Revolving Doors, and Hunting Bears. To me, both of those tracks really don't add anything to the album and just mess with the flow, and I think they could have been left off of the record entirely and it would have made it a better album altogether. Aside from those two songs, I've always found that the last 4 tracks of this album lose a little bit of momentum for me. They're not all bad tracks, but I feel like all of the high points on this album happen between tracks 1 and 7. So this record certainly has some exceptional tracks, but it also has a few skip overs that I do think hurt the momentum of the record more than I would like them to. And because this record is so often compared to Kid A, I would say that I think Kid A is the far superior record of the two. So not a bad album. I would say it's pretty good, but definitely not one of their best. So I will give this a B. All right, moving on, we have their 6th studio album from 2003 titled Hail to the Thief, and I will give this an A. I love this record. I think it's a lot better than some people give it credit for, and I would regard it as the most underappreciated Radiohead album because I think there is a lot of great stuff all throughout this. This album features more of a combination of the rock elements and the electronic elements that we heard on Amnesiac and Kid A. It's a pretty long record with 14 tracks coming in at over 56 minutes in length, and I think my only critique of this record would be that I do think it is a tad long, and I think it could have been trimmed down to maybe 11 or 12 songs and could have been a bit better, because I do think about 85% of this album is fantastic, but it does have a couple of songs here and there that I'm not crazy about and take away from the album the tiniest bit, and is ultimately why I put it in A tier rather than S. I think the opening 3 songs are pretty much perfect. 2 + 2 = 5 brings things in the most awesome and mysterious way possible. Sit Down, Stand Up continues on that darker vibe with nice electronic backdrops, and Sail to the Moon is my favorite song from this album and one of my favorite Radiohead ballads. The chord progressions in the piano and guitar and the dark vocal melodies create such a magical sound that I love so much. Another noteworthy piano ballad is We Suck Young Blood, which contains a lot of those similar elements that Sail to the Moon does. Other noteworthy songs for me on here would be Scatterbrain, Go to Sleep, There, Myxomatosis, and the closer, A Wolf at the Door, which is such an awesome closing track to this album, taking the listener through so many different emotions and concluding this very unique album perfectly. And I had mentioned that there are a couple of songs that I'm not crazy about, and those would be Backdrifts, The Gloaming, and I Will. I think if they had omitted a couple of those tracks, this album very well could have been a contender for S tier for me, because I do really think that highly of the majority of the remainder of the track listing, but I do think this record does suffer from being just a tad too long, which makes it drag a little bit, and ultimately for me just takes away from it the tiniest bit. But in the midst of that, I think they still wrote some incredible songs that stand the test of time as classic and timeless Radiohead tracks. So a great album. This one gets an A. Okay, next we have their 7th studio album from 2007 titled In Rainbows, and this one gets an easy S. Probably not a huge surprise to most people. This is an absolutely incredible record, and this one goes down as my favorite Radiohead album. I think this is pretty much a perfect record from front to back. Stylistically, there are a lot of similarities to what they were doing on Hail to the Thief, but the songwriting is even more enhanced, and the pacing of the tracks and the blending of different styles results in an album that really feels like an adventurous story with all sorts of twists and turns and never a dull moment, fusing together all of the best elements of the Radiohead sound, showcasing their electronic art rock elements on the opening track 15 Step. Then we have some incredibly lush and ethereal moods on tracks like Nude, All I Need, and Reckoner. Then there are some higher energy tracks that are equally as moody, like Weird Fishes and Jigsaw Falling Into Place. We get that classic Radiohead rock vibe on Body Snatchers, and two beautiful ballads, one of them being the acoustic guitar-centered Faust Arp, and then the closer, which is the piano ballad Videotape, easily one of my favorite closing songs of any Radiohead record. And another thing I will say is that out of every Radiohead album, this is the one that contains the largest amount of my favorite Radiohead tracks. All I Need is my all-time number one favorite Radiohead song. That is a song I can listen to over and over and over again and never get tired of it. In addition to that, Weird Fishes and Nude would also make my top 10 Radiohead song list, so I cannot say enough good things about this record. I love everything about it, and I think it is their most consistent album of their discography from front to back, and contains a good chunk of some of the best songs that they've ever written. So this is my number one favorite Radiohead album. This one gets an easy S. Alright, moving on, we have their 8th studio album from 2011 titled The King of Limbs, and unfortunately I'm going to give this one a C. Not a huge fan of this record. I think it was a significant downgrade from In Rainbows, and on this one they decided to go in a more experimental electronic direction, and while this is a sound that they do have a history of pulling off very well, I don't think this album resulted in any tracks that I would regard as essential or classic Radiohead tracks in comparison to just about every other album in their discography. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely some cool moments throughout this album, and there are songs that I do enjoy, but this is not a Radiohead record that I really ever find myself going back to, and it doesn't have any tracks that I would regard as favorites of mine. And it's on the shorter side, being a little under 38 minutes in length and only having 8 tracks, which I think could also contribute to the general underwhelming feeling that I get about this album. But in the midst of that, like I said, there are still some things that I do enjoy. I think the opening track, Bloom, is a great opener and a very fascinating song from an electronic standpoint. All sorts of really unique sounds and textures happening all throughout this track. I also enjoy Little by Little, and I think Lotus Flower is pretty solid. My favorite song from this album, though, would be Codex. That is a beautiful piano ballad that I think stands out within this track listing. But again, although I like some of these songs and I can appreciate different elements to each of them, I'm still left with an unsatisfied feeling towards this record, and pretty much every other record on this list, with the exception of Pablo Honey, contains other songs that I think are much better overall Radiohead tracks in the grand scheme of their discography. So it didn't feel right putting it in B tier because I do like Amnesiac more, and I think it has stronger individual songs. But if I had to pick between this and Pablo Honey as my least favorite Radiohead album, I would probably go with Pablo Honey, just because I feel like that one sounds a little bit more dated, whereas this record still does contain more of those modern Radiohead sounds, which I do enjoy. But regardless of that, this one is not one of my favorite records of theirs, so I'm going to give this a C. Okay, and lastly, we have their 9th and most recent studio album from 2016 titled A Moon-Shaped Pool, and I will give this an A. I thought this album was surprisingly good. I remember back when I first heard that it was coming out, I really didn't know what to expect, especially with King of Limbs being the album that preceded it, which I wasn't super crazy about, but I thought this was a massive improvement and would probably go down as my 4th favorite Radiohead album after the 3 that are in S tier, so I do hold this album in very high regard. This one is much less experimental than the King of Limbs was, and it's in more of that general art rock sort of realm with some elements of electronic, and also the beautiful addition of a string and choral section from the London Contemporary Orchestra, which adds some really beautiful textures to these tracks. The album is 11 songs long, and it opens up with the lead single, which was Burn the Witch, which gives us some classic Radiohead alt-rock vibes with the addition of the string section, an awesome track to open this record with. Then the album continues with a mixture of some piano-centered ballads on tracks like Daydreaming, Glass Eyes, and the closer, True Love Waits. All 3 of these songs I think are spectacular. Daydreaming is my favorite song on this album and would definitely make my top 10 Radiohead song list. Then there are a couple more art rock tracks with Dex Dark, Full Stop, and Identikit. And there's some very nice acoustic-centered tracks with Desert Island Disc, The Numbers, and Present Tense. I wouldn't say that this album is as groundbreaking as a record like OK Computer or Kid A or In Rainbows was for Radiohead's evolution of their sound, but I think this record offers some top-quality songwriting and a great selection of tracks that I think give a little bit of everything for every different kind of Radiohead fan. So a very good album, my fourth favorite Radiohead record. This one gets an A. Alright, we did it. We went through their 9 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. With a lot of these tier lists, there will oftentimes be a couple of albums from different bands' discographies that I do need to go back and re-listen to a few times to really solidify my thoughts on them. But with Radiohead, the scoring pretty much ended up exactly as I thought it would. Nothing really changed after listening to any of these records again more recently, and it's probably just because I've been a Radiohead fan for over 10 years now, so I think I've had enough time to really sit with a lot of these albums, and I can confidently say that these are my accurate thoughts on each record from their discography. Obviously, it goes without saying that they are one of the most influential and important rock bands to come out of the 90s and have managed to continue to evolve their sound and stay relevant and contribute great albums all the way up to their most recent record of their discography. And if they end up releasing a 10th album, I have no doubt that there will be some great stuff on it, and I look forward to seeing what this band continues to do and what Tom York and Johnny Greenwood continue to do with their solo discographies, because these guys are true musical icons that have produced some of the best music of the last 30 years. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you're interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the comments and the description and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 9 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that's it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.